wanted to talk to him at some time too. Let me do that ahead of time. We're not starting yet. I'm going to say something first.
Okay. We ask, of course, that you really consider what Don has asked you to do. Don and his early staff have done an outstanding job in bringing us to the point that we're in right now, and we do need some help here. So think about it and come forward, and you'll get all the help we can give you. Before we start, I have a couple of things I want to review with you. The first is I'm going to remind you again about the Air Museum, Delaware Valley Historical Aircraft Association on the property of the Naval Air Station. I have some folders at the back table there that you're welcome to take. It shows the schedules of times that we're open, talks about some of the airplanes that are on exhibits, and also has a membership form that we certainly would appreciate some of you joining and showing your total interest in the Delaware Valley Museum, and you'll find your time up there well spent, and I can't tell you how much fun I've had in being a tour guide up there and discussing World War II and my sort of minor experiences in World War II. So think about the Air Museum on the Naval Air Station. You do not go through security to get into the museum. When you get close to CNC Ford, going north on 611, you get in the left lane, and you'll turn into the parking lot of the museum. So it's very easy to get in and very easy to get out. So keep that in mind. See, there's a new organization that we're going to be involved in. It's called Artists in World War II. It's going to be in New Canaan, Connecticut, and some of our people are going up there to participate in it. And we'll certainly keep you posted. Cecilia Barnett is the coordinator in this area, and she's the curator of Carriage Barnack Center at Waveney Park, New Canaan. So you'll be hearing more about that in our bulletin. Sheila Martin and her group are busily trying to contact all the schools in the area that were gracious to invite us last year, and we're hoping that the veterans in the classroom are going to continue to blossom as we did last year. So we'll keep you posted in that regard. Just before I get started here, I want to talk about 8th Air Force Week. 8th Air Force Week honors those veterans and airmen that were shot down between 8th and 14th of October 1943. 148 bombers were lost in 1 week. Listen to this. Bremen, Germany was bombed by 357 bombers. 30 bombers were lost. That was 8% loss. 9th of October, Ancon, Germany, and Gdynia were bombed by 311 bombers. 28 were lost, 8% loss rate. 10 October, Münster was bombed by 236 bombers, 30 lost, 13% loss rate. 14 October, Schweinfurt was bombed by 229 bombers, 60 bombers lost, 26% loss ratio. 148 bombers. At that time, there were 10 in an airplane. 10 men were either killed or taken prisoner in 1 week in October of 43. So during the week of 8 to 14 October, do think of these airmen who were killed at that time. By the way, the losses of this week forced the 8th Air Force to cease raids deep into Germany until the Wilhelmshaven raid on the 3rd of November, when the P-47s finally used finally use drop tanks to increase the range to protect the bombers. We're going to start with the pledge, and Dave Hauer, will you please lead us into the pledge? Thank you, David. I have an invocation I'd like to present to you. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day and the opportunity to spend several hours in reflection and remembrance as we remember all those killed in action in World War II, and those killed in 9/11/03 by terrorists, and those killed in Iraq and Afghanistan. We thank you for our health and the strength that it gives us to do your work. And we remember the sick, especially those members of the lecture series who can't be with us today because of sickness, our veterans being cared for in hospitals throughout this country. And we ask a blessing on those present who are suffering either personal or family sickness. We thank you for all the friends and the fellowship made possible by membership in this World War II lecture series. And we remember the lonely and the depressed. And we pray that these remembrances will move us to action so we can better serve you. Amen. We're going to go from the sublime to the ridiculous now. I was sent this poem a few weeks ago, and I want to share it with you. This is called A Special Poem for Senior Citizens. A row of bottles on my shelf caused me to analyze myself. One yellow pill I have to pop goes to my heart, so it won't stop. A little white one that I take goes to my hands, so they don't shake. The blue ones that I use a lot tell me I'm happy when I'm not. The purple pill goes to my brain and tells me that I have no pain. The capsules tell me when not to wheeze or cough or choke or even sneeze. The red ones, smallest of them all, go to my blood so I won't fall. The orange ones, very big and bright, prevent my leg cramps in the night. Such an array of brilliant pills helping to cure all kinds of ills. But what I'd really like to know is what tells each pill where to go. And there's one more addition to this. There's always a lot to be thankful for if you take the time to look for it. For example, just standing here, I'm thinking how nice it is that wrinkles don't hurt. Our speaker today is Tech Sergeant Richard Miller, flight engineer on a B-24. Flew 34 combat missions over Eastern and Western Europe, namely Northern Italy, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Germany, Yugoslavia, and Hungary. I'm not going to take any more time talking about his experiences because he's going to tell us all about it. He'll talk for some time, and then we'll have questions and answers, and we'll follow the procedures that we've done in the past. When the question and answer period starts, I will come to you and give you the microphone, and you will ask your question, and then I'll move to the next person. So without further ado, Richard Miller.
First, I want to, can everybody hear me? Okay. I suppose you all know that the Army has certain ways of operating, and they have a reputation for putting the right man at the wrong job. I was one of the lucky ones. I was put at the right job. And the reason I say that is being a flight engineer in the service, I graduated from high school in 1940, and one of my classmates and I went to California to go to aircraft school. We both graduated a year later, and I took a master mechanics course, and I got a job in Sacramento, California at McClellan Air Base, and I worked there until December the 7th when something happened at Pearl Harbor, and I kept working there, but we were working 7 days a week at that time. And in the early spring of '42, I transferred to Olmsted Field near Harrisburg, and I worked there one day, and they asked me if I wanted to transfer out. I said, I just got here yesterday. I'd kind of like to hang around and see what it's like. So I asked them where they wanted me to transfer to, and they said, well, you have your choice of Rome, New York, Presque Isle, Maine, Pope Field, South Carolina, or Juneau, Alaska. I said, well, I don't want to go to any of those places, so I refused. And I was 20 years old at the time, and the next day they came around to ask me if I wanted to go to Trinidad. I said, where's that? He said, I don't know. So I went home and talked to my dad, and I got an atlas out to see where Trinidad was. There were two Trinidads in the atlas. One was a small island down in the South Atlantic, and the other was a little island off the coast of Venezuela. And that's the one he wanted me to go to. So they said, well, you're a junior aircraft mechanic. The next step is a mechanic, and then the next step is a senior mechanic. So he said, if you go to Trinidad, we'll jump you from junior to senior mechanic, and you get 25% bonus because it's combat area. There's submarines around the area. So I accepted. I thought, or I borrowed all the money to go to school to get the A&E license, and if I'd get a good job that pays twice what I was making. My initial job paid $1,680 a year. So anyway, I went to Trinidad. I was there 14 months, and the reason I never went in the service up to that point was I had 20/30 eyesight in my left eye. And the pilots can't be 20/30 eyesight. I had 20/20. So I thought, well, if I can't fly them, I'll fix them. So I got a mechanic's license, and I did all right. But after 14 months in Trinidad, they posted a notice on the bulletin board that any GI or civilian that has 20/30 eyesight that wants to be a pilot, they would accept you. So I was on foreign soil. I couldn't enlist. So I wrote them a draft board and said, draft me. And they did. I got in as a fighter pilot, and I got to pre-flight school at the University of Tennessee, and I was only there about 6 weeks. And General Arnold, who was the commandant of the Air Force, he said, we now have enough pilots to win the war. This was in February of '44. I was drafted in November of '43. So the next day, 500 of us were sent to gunnery school down in Florida, and that was a 7-week course. And the day that I graduated, my grandmother died. My father sent me a telegram, said, can you get an emergency furlough? So I got a furlough, and I went home for the funeral. By the time I got back to the base at the gunnery school, 499 guys had shipped out. They got a PFC stripe and went to B-29s as career gunners. But since I was a licensed mechanic, I got 2 stripes, and I was classified as a flight engineer. So the other 499 went to B-29s, and I went to B-24s. I got on a crew and took all my training at March Field, California. We got through our training on December 23rd, 44, and they shipped us to, we took all our training for the South Pacific. The training consisted of bailing out over water and jungle survival, basically. So we were all scheduled to go to the South Pacific. Well, they shipped us New Year's Eve. We arrived at Hamilton Field in San Francisco. We were supposed to pick up a B-24 and fly it to the South Pacific and fight the Japs. Well, as the Army does things, they put us on a train and sent us to Virginia. We wound up on a boat going to Italy. So we didn't know where we were going when we got on the boat, and it was the America, which had been renamed the West Point during the war. It's a beautiful boat, but they took all the chandeliers and all the stuff out of it, and we had a tough time. We stood in line for breakfast. By the time we got breakfast and got back to where we were supposed to be, it was like 16 decks. We stand in line for lunch, and then we'd find our way back again, and then we stand in line for dinner. All we did was stand in line, so I walked across the ocean. Well, when 2 days at sea, they announced that this ship was bound for Naples, Italy. I thought, good old sunny Italy. When we got there in January, it was 6 inches of snow on the ground with a blizzard raging and cold, and I had spent 4 winters in Southern California, Florida, and down in the Caribbean. So I wasn't accustomed to cold weather, and I almost froze to death when I got to Italy. But when we got there, they put us in tents, in a tent city. We were not allowed to build any fires to keep warm because they said, well, there may be enemy airplanes around that might pick up the light and bomb us and so forth. So one fellow didn't believe that, so he started a fire and he burned his tent down and all his equipment and all the equipment of the other 5 guys. And eventually a day or 2 later, I guess was, they put us on, as they referred to in World War I, the old 40 and 8 box cars. They were box cars that would handle 40 men and 8 horses. And we boarded this train just to go across Italy and just a little bit south to Bari, which was 15th Air Force headquarters. And on the way, it was still cold, even in the boxcars. There's no heat or anything. So we built a fire in the center of the boxcar, and every time the train would stop, which was about every 10 miles, we'd hop off and see if there's any wood around that we could confiscate so we could keep our fire going. And by the time we got to Bari, we had a hole in the floor about 18 inches in diameter with a fire all the way around it. And when we got to Bari, they assigned my crew to the 376th Heavy Bombardment Group. Now, this might be a good place to tell you what you've heard of squadrons and groups and wings and elements and whatever. But the 15th Air Force at that particular time was headed up Jimmy Doolittle. The 376th was not formed, well, it was formed right after Pearl Harbor in the end of December. They commissioned a Colonel Halverson to, they gave him 4 B-24s, and he was supposed to pick his own men, ground men, flying personnel, commanding officers, and so forth. So he started picking his men, and they thought that 4 airplanes. What the idea was, President Roosevelt decided that since Pearl Harbor was bombed, he was going to hit Japan. He wanted to bomb the mainland of Japan, the homeland, and he was going to bomb it from the sea, but they didn't have any bombers or bases close enough from which a B-17 could reach Japan. So he thought, well, Jimmy Doolittle said, well, I think I can get a B-25, which is a twin-engine bomber. I think I can get a B-25 off a carrier. We can take them in close enough to Japan so that they can reach Japan, and then instead they can't land on a carrier because all the B-25s that he had to be hoisted on the carrier with a crane because you can't land a B-25 on a carrier. And then if the carrier would take them close enough to Japan where they could take off and reach Japan and have enough gas left to go to China, they had a base in China all lined up. Well, this Colonel Halverson, he was supposed to pick a crew of men for each of his airplanes, and he thought the 4 airplanes isn't going to do much. The 4 airplanes could carry as much as 16 of the B-25s that went off the carrier. But as it turned out, they got 20 more B-24s, and of course, the B-24 was a brand new airplane. It was only designed in '39, and they didn't have any operational, no bomb groups or anything with B-24s. It was all B-17s. And there were only, our entire Air Force at that time consisted of only 70 B-17s, and a lot of them were in foreign countries. So they were commissioned to get crews for all the 24 B-24s, and they got underway. They took their training in the early part of '42, and they left in May of '42 from MacDill Field, Florida, and they were going to fly to Puerto Rico, from Puerto Rico to Belém, Brazil, and from Belém, Brazil to Accra, Ghana on the west coast of Africa, and then to Egypt, and then to China, India and China. Well, as soon as they got these new B-24s, there's a lot of bugs in them that hadn't been ironed out. So the first leg was from MacDill Field, Florida to Borinquen in Puerto Rico, and they didn't have any facilities to work on B-24s in Puerto Rico, so they flew on to Trinidad, where I was. And I worked on those B-24s, and later I might have flown the same airplanes. I didn't keep a record of the serial numbers, but it could have been possible. But they had all kinds of problems, and they finally arrived in Fayid, Egypt, and the only 23 of them made it. The 24th one had all kinds of problems that couldn't be solved. So they met in Egypt, and when they got there, they found out that the base they were going to be stationed at in China had been overrun by the Japanese, so they couldn't go. So they stayed in Egypt, and Eisenhower took over at that point. He said, well, I don't care how much equipment the Germans have. If they can't move it, they're going to lose the war. And to move it, you need gas and oil. So the Ploesti oil fields and refineries came to his attention, and in Ploesti they had 7 refineries around the town of Ploesti in Romania. And they were supplying about 65% of the German requirements. So the first mission that the group flew was from Fayid, Egypt to Ploesti. And they had to take off at 11:30 at night and fly all night. And they reached Ploesti at 7 in the morning. They dropped their bombs from high altitude. I think they were up probably around 27,000 feet. And they didn't do too much damage. But they had a pretty rough time. They only had 13 airplanes that were combat ready, and they sent the 13 out, and 4 returned. So it was a pretty tough target. It was the most heavily guarded target in the whole war. The second heaviest was Vienna, and the third was Berlin. They didn't do too much damage, so they decided that they would have to do something about it. And it was, they said since they missed it from high altitude, that they said if we go in at 50 feet, we can't miss. So they practiced bombing from 50 feet, and some of the airplanes were blown up by their own bombs. But it took from the first mission that they flew from Egypt to Ploesti was June the 12th, 1942. And they didn't fly another mission to Ploesti until August the 1st of 43. They sent 177 airplanes on that mission, not all from our group, but it was a couple of bomb groups that had been formed since ours had been formed. They sent 177 and 57 got shot down. It was a miracle that it wasn't more, because when you go in that, you rifle fire and even pistol fire from the ground could knock a bomber down if you hit it at the right place. So they did quite a bit of damage, but it still wasn't enough. So in the ensuing time that the war lasted, the 376th hit that same target, Ploesti, 14 times, and they lost. We lost a total in the war. We lost 169 airplanes. 67 of them were over Ploesti. I was very fortunate. I arrived overseas after Ploesti was flattened, so I didn't have any Ploesti missions. The day that we arrived at our group, there was only, they sent, I think there were 10 crews that they selected in California to go to Italy. And of the 10 crews, only 4 were assigned to the 376, one for each squadron. I said I was going to explain what an Air Force consists of. I have a chart here, 15th Air Force, and we were part of the 47th Wing. There are 4 groups in a wing. Now, an Air Force, according to Jimmy Doolittle, we had a fighting strength of 20,000 men. But in one 12-month period, we lost 20,500 men. That's not a very good percentage. But there are 4 groups, and each group has 4 squadrons. Each squadron has 7 airplanes or more, usually 7. And each squadron, when you see a picture of airplanes flying formation, it's usually in a V. 3-ship V is an element, and the way they fly, the lead ship flies at one altitude, the number 2 flies a high right, probably 25 feet higher than the first one, and the number 3 man is a low left, he's 25 feet below and to the side. You can't follow an airplane directly because of the slipstream. The turbulent air, if you ever get in it, which we did once, was something else. We were, and then the next V, the center airplane flies 25 feet below the lead airplane in the first element, and then a high right and a low left, and then tail end Charlie is way down here. He's the guy who usually gets hit by fighters. I was going to say, this is a chart showing various medals that are won for one reason or another. Our group is a 376th. In our wing was the 98th group, the 449th group, and the 450th group. This is a headquarters squadron, whatever. The DSC, that's a Distinguished Service Cross. That's next to the Medal of Honor. We got 3, nobody else got any. The Legion of Merit, 443, none. Silver Star, 55, 59, 41, 55. And a Distinguished Flying Cross, 202, 334, 211, and 352. The Soldier's Medal, 33, 23, 22, and 11. The Bronze Star, 7, 22, 14, and 1. The Purple Heart, which nobody wants, 339, 395, 227, 281. And the Air Medal, that's that one, 7,543, 6,544, 603, and 6,179. So the totals, our group, the 376th, earned 8,186 total medals. The 98th was 7,381. The 449th was 6,552, and the 450 was 6,879. The total of just our group, 29,047 medals. Of course, nobody really wants any of them, but certain things you do, you earn them. When we arrived in our group, we were the only crew that arrived that day, and the commanding officer took us aside and he said, "Men, you're very lucky." He says, "The war's scaling down and it's going to be peaches and cream from here on in. Nothing to worry about." This was January, the first week of January 45. And I thought the war was scaling down too. It's normal practice for the pilot of a new replacement crew arriving overseas. The pilot flies as a co-pilot with an experienced crew to find out what combat's all about. Well, my pilot went his first mission, he got shot down. Well, he wasn't really shot down. Their airplane was damaged so badly that they just knew they couldn't make it back to the base, because we were way down in the heel of Italy, whereas before they were bombing from Africa. But when they pushed the Germans far enough north in Italy, we took the first base that was available. So we were the first bomb group that was formed after Pearl Harbor, first one that was deployed overseas, first one to bomb European soil, first one to be located on European soil, and we were the first ones to come home. Anyway, the commanding officer took us and he said, "You men will not be here long enough to finish your tour of 50 missions." So we were happy to hear that, but we didn't place too much confidence in him, because the next day they had an all-out effort. They sent 10 airplanes out from our squadron and 1 came back. Now I thought, I don't think the war's scaling down very much. So it was then the standard practice after the pilot goes on his first mission and returns, then the flight engineer goes on a mission with an experienced crew, and then they fly as a crew if he comes back. Well, I came back, but the pilot didn't. So I was scheduled to fly the next day, but it was bad weather at the target. There's no bad weather in Italy, but you got to have the right weather at the target. So the mission was canceled, and the next day it was canceled again, and I think it was 3 or 4 days in a row that it was canceled. Well, when they change engines in a B-24, they have to have a a skeleton crew, a pilot, co-pilot, navigator, radio operator, and engineer, to slow time it, just fly it around, around for 4 hours. And if it's still flying in 4 hours, then it's combat ready. Well, I was scheduled to fly engineer on this test flight, and I reported out to the airplane, and the pilot said, he looked at my fatigues, he saw 2 stripes, because I was a corporal. He said, "Are you a corporal?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Well, you can't fly engineer, you got to be a tech sergeant." I said, "Well, give me 3 stripes and let's go. You know, makes me a better engineer." So he got in the airplane, he called the tower. He says, "I have a corporal out here for flight engineer." He says, "I got to have a tech sergeant." They said, "Well, just stand by for a while, we'll look into it." So we were there about an hour waiting for him to decide what's what and who's who. Here comes a Jeep out to the airplane, hand a piece of paper, "You're now tech sergeant. Let's go." So the pilot he went down in Yugoslavia, and there's a very funny story involved with that. They had a wounded photographer on board, so there was 11 men on their airplane, and they lost 2 engines over the target. It was Vienna, and they, of course, headed back towards the base, and the engineer decided they wouldn't make it because they lost too much gas, and you lose 2 engines, you're going to slow down. And they decided to head south and see how far they get. So fortunately, they were up around 28,000 feet. And as they headed south, the 3rd engine started to miss, and they decided, and they were losing altitude because on 2 engines you can't hold altitude. They were throwing things overboard for less weight, but they couldn't throw enough overboard. Well, they got as far as Zagreb, Yugoslavia, and they were down to about 8,000 feet, and they decided to look for a field to land in. They picked a farmer's field, and the pilot, the aircraft commander, he wanted to issue a instruction to bail out, but they had this wounded photographer on board. They couldn't throw him out because he wouldn't know how to land with being wounded, so they decided to land. So they picked a field, and the 3rd engine started to miss at that point. They only had the good number 4 yet, and it's very difficult to fly a 4-engine airplane on 2 engines because there's so much torque from all the thrust being on one side of the aircraft that you've got to stand on the rudder pedals to keep it straight. And they were standing on the rudder pedals for about 40 minutes and about ready to give up because their legs were giving out, both the pilot and the co-pilot. But anyway, they decided to land. They picked this field, and when you make an emergency landing, you always start very high in case something happens, that you have altitude to do something with. Well, fortunately, the field that they picked had 15 inches of snow on it, which helped in the landing. And they would have made a fairly good landing, but on the final approach to the field, the 4th engine quit, so they didn't have any engines. And the B-17 crews always said that a B-24 without engine glides like a rock. And they're almost right. But my pilot said, when he came back, he said, "Slim, don't let anybody tell you that a B-24 won't glide without engines. Of course, you got to get up a little speed." But they landed, they would have landed okay, but they were headed for some sort of a stone building, so they had a kick left rudder and just slide it in sideways in the snow, and they all walked away from it except the photographer. They had to carry him. But the pilot thought that they didn't know if they were friendly people or enemies or Germans or whatever. So he thought, well, if I take the wounded man, they'll have pity on us. So he grabbed the wounded man and walked up towards his house, and a guy came running out of the house, and my pilot said, asked him, he yelled out to him, "Do you speak English?" He said, "Yes, I'm from Milwaukee." He went over to visit his relatives there, and the war broke out, and he couldn't get home. So they took good care of him, and 3 weeks later, the 15th Air Force flew a C-47 and picked up the whole crew and a couple other fellows that were there, and flew them back to Bari, Italy. And then they had 3 more weeks of rehab. And I asked him at the last reunion, which was just last week, I said, "Fred, you were shot down your first mission and you had your rehab." I said, when they said your rehab is finished and you were scheduled to fly another mission, I said, what was going on in your mind? What were you thinking? He said, "Words can't describe it." He said, "I hate to think of going a second time and getting shot down again." But he had good luck ever since then, so until the second last mission. We only flew 3 missions with our own pilot, because while he was shot down, we flew with 14 different pilots. The first one we flew with was a lieutenant by the name of Hard Luck Pitts. It was his 13th mission. It was Friday the 13th, and it was the second time that he brought the airplane back to the base he started from. So we were on edge quite a bit till we got back to the base with him as a pilot. Turned out to be an excellent pilot, but he was very nervous, and he had landed on coming back from one mission. He landed, and the nose wheel collapsed. It wasn't locked. So they fixed the airplane up, and he flew my crew on that same airplane. And when we were coming back from the mission, you always fly with the wind and then turn and land into the wind. You always put the landing gear down when you're on a downwind leg. So I put the gear down, and he asked me, "You sure it's locked?" I said, "Well, I'll check it." So I went down to the nose wheel, and there's just a latch that goes over, and sometimes the spring is a little weak, and it'll flip, and then the gear will collapse, and your nose will go down and scrape the ground. Well, it was common practice that if the engineer didn't trust the latch, he'd take his belt off and wrap the belt around. So he asked me a second time, "Is the gear down and locked?" I showed him my belt. I said, "No belt." He's okay. Of course, you had to dig through a lot of clothing, because when we would go out to the airplane, first thing I would do with the pilot was make a complete circle, look at everything outside the airplane. It's called a pre-flight, to make sure that everything is okay. And then you get dressed. The first thing you do is you take your GI shoes off and wire them to your parachute, because I can't get around the airplane with a big bulky parachute hanging on my chest. So that's put aside, and if you have to bail out, you just take it, and you have rings on your parachute harness and 2 hooks on the parachute itself, and you just snap it on, and your shoes are with you. The reason you wire your shoes is that the first thing you wear is long johns and rayon stockings and rayon gloves, and then you have wool socks, and then you have felt boots that are electrically heated, and they plug into the bottom of your trousers, and the trousers plug into the shirt, and the gloves plug into the wrists. And then you have a cord, it's about 6 or 8 feet long, that you plug into the airplane. That keeps you warm, because up at 30,000 feet, it's generally between 40 and 60 below zero. And you're never allowed to take your rayon gloves off, because if you touch anything at that temperature, you're stuck. Well, over the heated suit, you have a gabardine flying suit, which has pockets below the knees, and that has your survival kit and your escape kit in case you get shot down. And there's pills in there that are supposed to keep you alive food-wise for 30 days. You got to find your own water, I guess. Over the gabardine flying suit, you have the fleece-lined wool, fleece-lined leather suit, and then you have the Mae West in case you get shot down over water, and then you have the parachute harness. And I was very fortunate. I was about 135 pounds, but dressed up I was probably 200. And over everything, of course, is a 40-pound flak suit. That's small pieces of metal that prevent you from getting killed by flak. And you have a front piece and a back piece. And in the 376th, it was the only group in the whole 15th Air Force where the flight engineer did not fire a gun. Usually, the engineer flew the top turret, which was right on the flight deck behind the pilot. But in our group, the engineer just flew engineer. My job was on takeoff, well, before takeoff, there was an auxiliary power unit that supplied electricity until you got your engines going. We left that on until we taxi out to the runway, and then I'd go down under the flight deck and turn that off. And then I'd come up and I'd kneel between the pilot and co-pilot. And one of my jobs was to call out the airspeed to the pilot, because in a 24, you can't see the runway for 50 yards in front of the airplane because the nose is too high. So he's looking at the compass, not the magnetic compass, the gyro compass, and he gets the heading down the runway. So he's actually making an instrument takeoff without seeing the runway. But I have to tell him the airspeed, and because a B-24 takes off at between 130 and 140 miles per hour. And when it gets up to 130, he knows he can lift it off. Well, on takeoff, you use an awful lot of fuel because it has 4 1,200 horsepower engines, and they eat up pretty much gas. And after we get in the air, then every half hour, I have to check the fuel gauges to see how much fuel we wasted or used, and report to the navigator how many hours of flying time we have at the power settings that we're at. And I had to record each engine, what the RPM was, the manifold pressure and everything else. And going to the target, before we, usually around 8,000 feet, we normally carried 500 gallons of gas for each engine in the main tanks, and in the wingtips, there were tanks in the wings that each one held 375 gallons. So we had 2,750 gallons of gas. We would transfer half of the fuel. To do this, I had to go back through the bomb bay and climb up on top of the wing, which was inside the fuselage, not outside. And the control valves were, you could just about reach them. I don't know why they ever put them there. I was skinny enough to get there, but I imagine a 200-pounder wouldn't be able to get there. And there was no place to plug in your oxygen line. So the guy in the ball turret, we have the walk-around oxygen bottle, about this big, that lasted 3 minutes. And it took 28 minutes to transfer half the fuel. So I was up there. There's no place to plug in your electric suit, and after a while it gets pretty darn cold. And you have 28 minutes, about 9 times I'd throw him an empty, and he'd throw me a full tank of oxygen and plug it in. And it was a mess. I don't know why they ever did it. Later models, they had to transfer valves on the flight deck so you didn't have to crawl back through the airplane. But then you had to do the same thing on the way back from the mission, because sometimes the lead airplane doesn't use much gas, but everybody behind the lead airplane are jockeying their throttles to keep from falling back or overrunning the formation, and every time you jockey the throttle, you use 50% more gas. And if you can't bomb the main target, they always give you 2 alternates that you should go to. And if you have to go to the second alternate, usually on the way home you were sweating out gas. And a number of them ran out of gas on the final approach to the field. It was awful. We had a problem twice. And the one was the second last mission, was the last drive on Bologna before the Germans surrendered in northern Italy. We were going up to Brenner Pass, which was called Flak Alley. The Germans had to bring all of their supplies through Brenner Pass, and we kept bombing the bridge, the only bridge, and the Germans would repair it, of course, and as soon as they just about got it repaired, we'd go up and bomb it again. They never did use it. They were flying supplies in as a last resort, but they didn't have much gas for that either. Well, this one mission, the second last one, we were flying at 18,000 feet, and the Alps, or Dolomites, whatever they were, at that point were 14,000 feet. So, and they had guns right on the top of the mountain. So they're only shooting 4,000 feet. That's like shooting a fish in a barrel. Well, we saw our buddies get blown out of formation, and they went to Russia, because that was only 90 miles away, and Russia was friendly. And we just got over seeing them go down when we didn't get hit, but the burst of flak was under the left wing close enough that the force of the explosion just turned the airplane up like this. We were flying on the left side of the formation, and we dove right through the formation. Didn't hit any airplanes, but I could count the rivets on the others looking out through the bomb bay doors. That was scary. And I heard the pilot say, "John," that was the co-pilot, he said, "John, help me." Because we lost 8,000 feet before we got control of the airplane, and we lost one engine, and if you're eager enough, you can climb on 3 engines, and we were down below, we lost 8,000, we were 10,000 feet, and the mountains were at 4,000, we were on the wrong side. We had to get up and over them to go home. So we forced the airplane to climb on 3 engines. We climbed up to 4,000 feet, and we went over the crest of the mountain, brushing the trees, and we opened up all 3 engines wide going home, and we got there before the rest of the group because they kept going down Flak Alley. So when we came in alone, the commanding officer was there. "Where's the rest of the group?" You know. Well, we don't know. They kept going down Flack Alley. We got blown out of formation and came home. But about 15 or 20 minutes later, the rest of the group, minus the one airplane, came back. The other experience that almost ended the war for us, we were going down the runway, and I was calling out the airspeed, and all of a sudden I heard a bang. I thought, what's going on there? We had blown the right main tire at 130 miles an hour. He was just ready to lift it off when the tire blew, and we did 2 complete turns off the runway, didn't hit any of the parked airplanes, and the right tire caught fire. And at the first reunion that I attended, which was in 1995, my upper gunner was there, and I had forgotten all about this, and he said, Slim, he says, I never saw you move so fast as you did that day. I said, me move fast? I said, that's impossible. I'm never a fast mover. I said, what did I do? He said, well, you grabbed the fire extinguisher and you opened the bomb bay doors and went out and you put the fire out. I said, I did? I said, I don't remember it. Well, he says, you did. I said, well, probably I knew that there was 500 gallons of gas right up above that tire, and I didn't want it to go boom. Let's see, what time is it? I had, after the second last mission, the last mission was April the 15th, and the war didn't end until May the 8th, if you remember. And we were on the last mission, and we were probably maybe 5 minutes from the initial point of the bomb run, and we got a radio message, said, return to the base, pack your bags, you're going home. We didn't waste any time turning around. We got back to the base and they said, well, half of you are going home. So the way they decided who was going to go home, they said, well, the war is really scaling down, and if you have 15 missions or less, there's absolutely no possibility that you would be able to finish your 50 missions. So we had 30-some. Each crew member had a different number because we'd fly with different crews and not a full crew apart. It was a tough way to keep track of anything at all. But my pilot had 15, but since he was shot down on his first mission and had a rough time, they decided to let him go home, but they said, you can only take half your crew. Well, half of us were single, so we said, you guys go home. So complete crews that stayed over, they were transferred farther north, up near about as far up as Naples is, the Foggia area, and they were transferred up there a couple of days after the group broke up. They broke up and came home. And they told us that were staying over, take your tent down, the 6-man tent, and turn it in, and turn your cots in, and turn all your blankets in but one. And we did. And the ground crew packed everything up, and they left the next day. And they gave us K rations for 3 days. And we were just living under the stars. We had no barracks, and they took our tents. So we were just sleeping on the ground with one blanket. And they said, somebody will be in to pick you up. So 3 days later, they flew B-17s in to pick us up. Nobody wanted to go home because B-24 was our airplane. But since it was the only transportation, we decided to accept it. So they flew us to the 456th Bomb Group, a couple hundred miles north. And I got there, this Hard Luck Pitts at Pilot, he and I were the last two to be transferred because we weren't on a crew of any kind. So we got up to the 456th at lunchtime, and the officers and the enlisted men ate in the same mess hall, and we had our mess kits full of food, and with all of their crews and the crews that had been transferred in, there was no place to sit. And the last table, there's probably 30 tables wide. The last table, somebody, hey Dick, here was a crew that lived next door to me in the 376. And they said they only had 4 guys on their crew. They lost the radio operator and the nose gunner. Their radio operator volunteered to fill in for a radio operator on another crew who was sick and couldn't fly. So he volunteered to fill in for him. He was the only one killed on that mission. Everybody else returned home fine, but he didn't make it. But anyway, they had 4 men on their crew. And they said, we have a 6-man tent. There's 1 guy in there, but you can move in with us and maybe get on our crew as a nose gunner, because they already had an engineer, because we were just sweating it out to go home. So I said, okay, I can do that. So I moved into the tent with him, and the guy that was in the tent when they moved in a couple days before was from Reading, Pennsylvania. and the rest of the story you won't believe. Because after the war was over, I got married and all this and that, and it was probably 6 or 7 years after the war. I started work for my father-in-law, who had a battery factory, and it was normal practice for the factory to give free milk to the persons that worked in the dangerous departments where there was a possibility of contracting lead poisoning. So they gave them free milk, and that was a good antidote for it. Well, the fellow that was delivering the milk was this guy in the tent in Italy. I couldn't believe it. And he just died a little over a year ago. I saw his name in the paper. He had 49 missions in and couldn't get the last one in. So he had a sign on the front of the tent, 49 rough ones. Let's see. I could tell you, I had an experience before I went in the service when I was in Trinidad, and they said that they were going to accept 20/30 vision for pilot training. I wrote to my draft board and asked them to draft me, and they did. They only gave me 4 days to get home, and I couldn't get a priority to fly because I wasn't important enough. And I had to wait for a convoy. And we had gone to Trinidad in a convoy. And I think we had 11 ships going down. It took 2 weeks, and the ship was a Chesapeake Bay boat. It was never out on the ocean before, and I was told a story that they welded a false bottom on it and poured concrete in there so they have ballast to keep it upright. And it was designed for 250 passengers, but there were 600 on board, and it was kind of rough. I think the captain and I were the only 2 that weren't sick. But on the way back, I had to wait for a convoy, and I finally got in a 7-ship convoy, and ours was the biggest ship. It was the SS Monterey. It was a banana boat, and it was overloaded. And in order to accommodate me and a few others, they emptied out the swimming pool and put bunks in the swimming pool, so I slept in the swimming pool all the way home. But the second day out at sea, we saw something on the horizon. It was sticking out of the water, and we went over that way, and it was a ship just going down. And we picked up 4 survivors and dropped them off at Puerto Rico, and then we got in another convoy, and we were going to go to New Orleans, and the first the second night out at sea, one of the ships had a problem, I think with the steerage or something. And since ours was the biggest ship, the commodore of the convoy was on our ship, so he gave the orders. So when he found out about this problem, he sent up, in order not to break radio silence because there were submarines around, he sent up a flag message, and he told the ship to make for the nearest port, which was Mobile, Alabama. Well, I guess all the ships took it for granted that it meant them, so we woke up in the morning all alone, going like a bat out of you-know-what for New Orleans. We pulled in all alone. That was kind of scary when you see one ship go down. I don't think the Germans left. They're still here. So that's about. If you have any questions, I'd be happy. There's one.
I forgot the question. Your heated flying suit, what voltage was that?
What?
Voltage was your heated flying suit?
24.
24? Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
You had said that Vienna was the second most.
I can't hear you.
Vienna was the second most protected target in Austria. Vienna.
Austria.
Yeah, you said Vienna was the second most after Berlin. Vienna was second. I was wanting the significance of Vienna. Why was Vienna in Austria? Why
They were
was
a
that?
big oil center also.
Oh,
They
Vienna.
had refineries at Moosbeerbaum, Steyr, and a couple of other cities in that area. And Vienna had 455 flak guns within the city limits. And apparently we had a pretty good spy system, because if we go to briefing in the morning before a mission at, say, 4 o'clock in the morning, our intelligence officer could tell you that last night at 11 o'clock, they moved a flak gun from 4th and Spruce to 6th and Cherry.
Questions over here? Excuse me.
Sir, with more than 2,700 gallons of fuel on board, did you have self-sealing fuel tanks?
Yes.
Okay, well, that's good.
The
All right.
later models did, not the early models.
All right.
This
well,
is a
thank you.
This is a B-24J. The turret makes it a J. The wingspan, it was the biggest airplane at the time that we made. The wingspan was 110 feet. It was 70 feet long, and from the tip of the propeller to the ground was 30 feet and 1 inch.
Wow. All right. Thank you, sir.
Other questions over here?
Did you mention the Blesti oil fields flying out there over Romania?
Mhm.
You did.
Any more questions? Okay.
This isn't in the form of a question, and it's not to the speaker. Thank you for what you're doing. But our smaller attendance has made us have a financial crunch here, so if anybody would double up a little bit on the donations, it would help cover the expenses. We take the speaker out to dinner, and it costs us a little bit of money because he's not the only one that goes all by himself. So there's other expenses for tapes and for other items, so appreciate it if you could find an extra bill or two, put it in the kitty. Anything else?
Unless you want me to compare the B-17 to the B-24.
Okay, hold on, Bob. Bill's got a...
Okay, sir, I was just going to comment. I'm reading a biography of General Carl Andrew Spots, a Boyertown native who was one of the head generals during World War II in the Air Force. And one of his main objectives during the war was to knock out, of course, the German oil supply, and that did more than many of the other objectives, I guess. So.
He was our commanding officer for a short time. I might make one more comment. This was a special day for me because I met a classmate of mine from high school.
Good.
Right here. And I recognized her. After 64 years, I haven't seen her.
Are you going to sing that song, Promise Me That We'll Be Sweethearts, after graduation day?
No.
No, we won't do that.
Okay.
Where was your home? Were you from around this area here?
Reading. Yeah. Well, I was born and raised in Reading, and I'm living there now, but I spent 22 years in New Jersey in the meantime. That's it.
You go to the Reading Air Show every year?
I didn't make it the last 2 years because I'm also a singer. I sing in a barbershop chorus and quartet, and they happen to have their competition the same week as the air show, so I didn't make it.
Well, a couple of things. There's some display items that he's got up here you could come up to see. And Mia has another story that she can tell. So if you want to stay and hear another story, she told us about a story about a chair recently. Let's hear another story from Mia Greca, our Hollander. Is that the right way to say it?
Yeah, you can. Although I'm an American for longer
Okay.
than I was a Dutchman.
Okay.
Is there anyone here that it was in the infantry in the European theater, ETA? Okay, this story, you know, this is the 60th anniversary this year of the liberation of France. And the story is written, I'd like to go here, so put this down. The story is written by a woman that was a very small girl in the 40s. She is now, I calculate, about 60-some. She is writing a letter. The letter was written to the brother of a man that was missing in action for many years. And the story is like this. She says, "We live in a village where a terrible and particularly bloody battle took place in September of '44. 945 young American soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing during this 60-hour-long battle. And amongst them, it was the brother of this person she's writing. One day, a veteran of K Company who fought in the Horseshoe Woods told me that he prayed every day during the war. He prayed, of course, to stay alive, but also to be back home in any case, even if he were killed. He told me that it was his dearest wish and that it was the dearest wish of all his buddies. I never forgot his words, and I decided to do with Thanks GIs, which is an organization that was established in France. We vowed to do all our possible to help missing soldiers to be back home, and it is the least we can do for them. There were 26 soldiers reported as MIA in the Horseshoe Wood, which is a village near the Moselle River in France. We know that many of them drowned in the river during the withdrawal, and we can't do anything more for them. But many were killed in the wood, and so they're still there. We have a list with the names, the units, and the dates of death of all the MIAs of the 5th Division. And from the 11th Infantry Regiment archives and the date of death from September 8 to September 11, we could determine who were the soldiers possibly still resting in those woods. Now, the way the girl is writing this story, it is her high school English, and I'm reading it as such. It's not all polished English, okay? So she is saying, this group that was established to try and find the missing MIAs, she says, we make search for already a few years. So it's not by accident that we find an American, it's rather by chance. We are looking only for American MIAs, but sometimes we do find Germans. To protect the American missing still resting in the woods, we asked our mayor of Corny to take a decree forbidding the public access of the Horseshoe Woods. With other words, they wanted that sort of private ground. There are still traces of foxholes in the wood. They form a horseshoe and the defensive position taken by the Americans at that time. Owing to the books, but mostly to the testimonies of veterans, we know exactly the positions of each company that was in the horseshoe. For our search, we use metal detectors on the surface, and many times we pick up pieces of metal, thousands of bullets, shell splinters, shrapnel. But they ring, of course, every time. So now we dig systematically, even today, all the foxholes, one by one, up from the bottom. Because in 60 years, there has been a lot of leaves that have, formed a big layer. There were around 1,200 men in the wood, and according to the testimonies of the survivors, they dug around 3 holes per man. So there is no lack of work. I myself don't dig, it's too hard for me, only the boys. But I never miss any search, and I bring them my support. The brother of this man that she is writing, there was no trace of a foxhole where we found him. Just a little buckle of a chin strap of the helmet was laying on the ground, and that must have been a sign. I don't know, and I still wonder why we decided to dig there anyway. It was a good day. When we find an American MIA, we so soon inform the gendarmes, which is the French police, the mayor, and the U.S. Army Memorial Affairs. The police, for their part, informed the Attorney General and the prefecture. The team of the U.S. Army Memorial Affairs comes very quickly. We found your brother on September 13, the year 2000, so that's only 4 years ago, and they came the day after. I must tell you about them sometime. I will skip that part. Okay. In a parallel direction to our search in the Horseshoe Wood, we make search at Fort Driant. My husband's brother was in that battle too. It's a big fort close to Corny in France. A long and bloody battle took place. Tom Tucker, which was also from the 5th Division, he lives in California, and he is very instrumental in helping these people trying to find the missing men. There are still 5 American missing in actions in Fort Driant, but to make search there, that's different. It's a French army territory, and they use it for training and dogs training, so it's totally forbidden for us to enter there. Tom helped us a lot for our search in the Horseshoe Wood. He gave us precious information of the fighting, and he contacted us. I can say that the discovery of an American missing is the result of the common efforts of this organization in France and Mr. Tom Tucker, who is a retired veteran. The girl says, My love for my American liberators is a long story. I was very little when the war broke out, but later on, as a child, the American soldiers were gallant knights on white horses in my book of fairy tales. This girl is then about 6 or 7 in the war. The organization was born January 24, 1998, so it's fairly recent. It's only 6 years old. We created the association with friends and members of our family. So these people are civilians that want to do that out of love for the American veterans. They, different than the tourists that have not always been very welcome in France, these people, and I can vouch for that, I told you that during my last talk, they remember the liberators as their heroes, even till today. We were only 10 people, but quickly friends joined us. Now, today, there is 100 members in this association, thanks GIs. The oldest is 96, the youngest is 12. All these people are devoted to the same cause, to honor and thank our American liberators and to perpetuate their memory. Of course, neither the seniors nor the kids make search. The search are the job of a dozen strong fellows. The day when we found your brother, there were only 2 men searching in the wood. To the memory of the valiant American soldiers of the United States 5th Division who painfully crossed the Moselle River at that place in September 1944 for our freedom. So that is now 60 years ago. Every year in September we have a ceremony to commemorate the bloody battle at Horseshoe Wood, and they just had that last week. And then this year they erected a monument in a village located there. For the 60th anniversary of our liberation, well, we have many projects, but only one object. The object is memory. Take care, love, Elizabeth. So it goes to show you how much they love all that the GIs did over there to liberate them. Thank you.
Yeah, for another nice story. And I think it's well to remember that you hear a lot of bad press about the people in France and Germany and whatnot, but there's still some friends of America there. So keep it up. Keep what we're doing going. Let's see. I guess that's about it.